So yeah, I've done a little bit. This is my play school effort over here about intercropping. I won't go too much into the theory, but and I've got some bits and bobs to pass around. But basically, the theory, we'll talk about the practice later, is that crops in monocultures basically have very similar traits, and therefore they're competing intensely for the same resources. And plants and species mixtures have complementary, divergent traits and compete less for resources, etc. And also, yeah, there's different theories as well in terms of complementarity, so looking at how the canopy architecture, the root architecture of different plants is different, facilitation effects, so that's things like nitrogen fixation, phosphorus acquisition, and other micronutrients, and also kind of bringing up moisture from further down in the profile, and also complementary kind of mycorrhizal associations. And so, yeah, there's obviously there's a vast array of plant team combinations you could look at, and very little has been done in research, to be honest. And so, yeah, just interested to hear what different farmers are doing, what's working for them in the field. So, as part of the lab, we've got quite a mixture of different farms trying different species mixtures that could probably be loosely grouped into kind of all seed rate companion crops, legume and cereals, grain, legumes and cereals, and then undersowing clovers and legumes. So there's those kind of three general ideas, and people playing around with lots of other species and mixtures as well. And so I'll just go through what a few people are doing. So this is Mark Lee. Some of you might have heard of him as well, it's not Mark Lee. This is a crop of Carlin peas that he's growing for hogmedogs that you probably heard about yesterday, and triticale. And basically he's looking at the Carlin peas have a huge amount of biomass. They're just lodged like crazy when he goes to harvest them, and yeah, so he wants it to be a human consumption product. So looking at triticale and its role in structural support for that crop. So he's trying out different seed rates for that, 5, 10%, 15% and 20%, and a bit higher, yes, of the triticale. So keeping the same pea rates and varying the triticale seed rate, and then we're going to look at the impact on quite a basic kind of structure, just looking at how much is it lodged basically. We're on a 1 to 5 scale. So I'll just pass these around. Another one is James Hares. He's an organic farmer in Wiltshire. He is looking at wheat and beans. He had a huge wild oat problem, so he's basically looking at how putting wheat into the beans can control those wild oats. So I went out and did some biomass cuts a few weeks ago, and there's a very significant difference in the biomass of the wild oats, where he's got the wheat versus where he's got the monoculture, just because assumedly they're mopping up that nitrogen, they're filling those gaps. So it's not just, so the total biomass was more than 50% less, and also just anecdotally, like the size of the plants as well, just much smaller wild oat plants in the mixtures as well. So and then finally, so the Organic Research Centre also doing some trials. They're looking at also wheat and bean mixtures, and wheat and vetch. So again, trying different seed rates and something called the spring YQ population. I don't know if anyone's come across the idea of population, but it's basically a cross of multiple varieties of wheat. In this is a spring version of that. So, sorry. Yes, so that's some of those bits and bobs. But really the whole idea here was to pass it over to other farmers to share their experiences as well. So Andy has been innovating with plant teams, farm mixtures for 5 6 years more now. Did his Nuffield, hello. Did his Nuffield scholarship and travelled all around and learnt lots and has brought it all back, and it's really very exciting. So yeah, I'll pass you over to Andy.
Yeah, hi. I guess I'll just say what I'm done and what I'm doing this year, and I guess
if you talk about things
why
that
I've done
you've
it.
tried and what your objectives are, what they're
for me really is going around the world. The biggest lesson I got was diversity is key. I think you heard that from Joel yesterday. Diversity, diversity, diversity. And having monocultures is easy to manage, but has the issues of weed problems, disease problems, pest problems, and I can't see that the out the can is going to keep trying to solve it. So the idea is to design a system with diversity. So the first one I did was this one, which is the oilseed rape with berseem, clover and vetch, and that seemed to work well, so I carried on doing that for a few years while I still grew oilseed rape. And I think my neighbour Andy Barr, who writes in the Farmers Weekly, he finds that spring beans with winter oilseed rape is the best for flea beetle, and I've heard berseem clover as well. That it can save your crop, and you probably don't need a spray. So there's some significant benefits for winter oilseed rape with companion cropping, and on average they've found in France sort of a 0.3 a tonne a hectare yield increase for companion cropping. So the economics are there as well, and it's easy to manage because that stuff's gone by the spring. Whereas the other stuff that I'm doing is a bit more management, not as easy, because another example would be this one, the peas and the spring peas and spring oilseed rape. And the main reason I was doing that is because the biggest problem with peas is you get to harvest and you're dragging them off the floor. And the idea of the oilseed rape is a trellis and it holds it up. A bit similar to Mark Lee with his triticale with the peas. And last harvest was pretty bad August, and there was people writing off their pea crops because they couldn't harvest them. And the rape managed to keep it about that far off the ground, and we did manage to harvest it. So it's a bit of a risk management tool on that one. This year I've got beans, spring beans and spring oilseed rape, and that's spring oilseed rape's been a struggle this year, just with the wet spring, but the beans look well. And interestingly, we talk about resource scavenging. I did tissue tests last year from the peas and the rape, and the rapes had no fertiliser, but the tissue test came back almost perfect for every element. It had good nitrogen, everything. Potassium's one thing was low, so there's definitely something going on between the beans and the peas and the rape, and I've just had the results back for the beans and the rape, exactly the same thing. The rape, even though it's had no fertiliser, has got perfectly adequate amounts of nitrogen and everything else. There's definitely something going on underground. And the other one this year is oats and undersown clover. As Nathan was speaking before, it's undersown clover is fairly, I haven't found the magic answer to get established yet. It's patchy. I'll keep trying, because I think it's probably the one thing that, especially in a no-till situation, improving your infiltration, it definitely is the one thing that, if you can get it to work, will be massively beneficial. A guy I saw in France has stopped using fungicides and halved his nitrogen rates on his wheat, and it yielded exactly the same as his conventional wheat. So there's definitely a reason to carry on, but my only advice would be keep the seed cheap. You're just spending £60 a hectare every time to establish it, and it doesn't. That's not very useful. And the other one this year is lentils and linseed. Lentils is the new superfood apparently, so that's for hobnadods. I've never grown lentils, and I have no idea how it's going to work. But the idea came from Canada. Lentils are terrible for weed control, and also that having the linseed there is a risk management. If I don't get any lentils, I've still got some linseed. I did chickpeas and linseed last year, and the chickpea was a complete failure. But I did notice from the combine the yield of the lentils, linseed rocketed where it was with the chickpeas. So again, there's some benefits, but watch your space on that one. I think that's probably it for this year.
Have you noticed anything with the linseed? Have you noticed any habit weeds?
Weeds, yeah, grass weeds is fine, but broadleaf weeds, I was a bit late. Yeah, I've been not great at the moment. I think there's ways to get around it. But I think if you can get it, then it's going to be a valuable crop, especially with our Mediterranean weather we're having. Probably the only spring crop that's enjoying it at the moment.
Brilliant. Maybe I'll let Roger say a few words. So, yeah.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roger Vickers. I'm the head of the PGRA. We were inspired by things that were being seen and heard about on the farm. And after a visit to Andy last year, we decided that we would have a go at a little intercropping with peas. But our objective was slightly different. Not looking at land equivalent ratios, but at the conundrum of trying to support the peas. Varieties of peas are a lot better than they used to be, but you can never guarantee that they will be standing up at harvest. So, trying to present a solution to that, we looked at sowing them in companion with oats or barley or spring oilseed rape, and we're doing it on a plot scale, so not like a farm trial. The spring oilseed rape was a disaster. It just didn't appear, and I think that was probably our fault. Something to do with drilling, but also there was very heavy pest pressure as well. Well, I can't blame them for it entirely, because after harvest, when the stubble was removed, the oilseed rape decided to put in an appearance. The peas and barley looked fantastic for a while, but peas rapidly overdrew the barley and just chucked it to the floor. And Katie's got a picture there which just shows what happened. So you can see a few wisps of barley kicking around, but essentially I would suggest peas and barley are not really a goer based on our experience last year. And you can see there quite a lot of bindweed growing over there as well, so the weed suppression wasn't that great either. The peas and the oats, however, were very good. The oats were strong enough, tall enough to hold the peas up, and there is a photograph of that wandering about somewhere as well. Obviously. So you've got on the right hand side of the photo there, you've got the peas and the oats against the pure peas on the left hand side. And anecdotally, all the way through, the weed suppression was very significantly better with the oats on their own. The downside, if there is a downside, the best yielding plots were actually the peas on their own. But we've got trials combines, we get flat to the floor and we pick virtually everything up. I think on a commercial scale, the difference in yield was so small that farm scale combine would probably yield more with the oats and the peas. So we're trying it again this year at different populations to try and find out which is the best combination of oats and peas, and we're also trying peas and beans. The logic there goes along the lines of having similar chemistry available to them, and also perhaps beans being an even stronger structure for the peas to climb on. Watch this space.
What do you do harvesting terms between the bits and peas?
Yeah, it's an obvious one, we don't know. And clearly if you're trying to grow a nice, beautifully green pea and retain the colour, you've got nearly no chance. But if you grow a yellow pea, you can hang on for the beans and get them early, then you've probably got a good chance of getting a nice mixture. If the beans produce only a small grain, then maybe with difficulty in separation post-harvest. But if it's going for feed, then it doesn't matter.
Can I just make a comment about the... just picking up on Roger's comment about the mismatch between the peas and the barley there. We tried several different pea and barley combinations. It very much depends on the variety that you use. Some of them were really dominated and others weren't in terms of the peas. Less variability in the barley. But the peas needed matching. We've also been doing a lot of work on winter crops where we use winter peas. And there again, there's a lot of variation in the bigger of the peas, and some of them can bring things down. The same with using vetch or those things. Some of them can bring the cereal crop down, others are just fine. But the issue often is they don't perform the same year on year. One combination does well one year, the next year the figures seem to have changed. So it's very variable, and trying to get general rules on which varieties work with which is proving problematic at the moment. sorry, I should say I'm from James Industries, and we're involved in quite a lot of combinations at the moment with spring crops. So again, we've got the lentils with peas at the moment, and beans with wheat and various things like that. Some of them for forage production, some of them going through to harvest.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well in terms of thinking about the end use and the markets, because obviously it's all very well putting these mixtures together, but it's pretty important to think what your objective is. You know, are you looking for structure for your peas? Are you looking for weed suppression? Are you looking for fertility? And then also, your end market. So maybe, and I think so. James has, for example, with the beans and wheat mixture, he's looking to harvest both together and feed that to his cattle he's got on farm. Whereas others, so I will pass that to Andy, are looking at on-farm separation to have those as two crops to go on. So if you want to say a few words about that and market.
Yeah. It's probably the thing that you probably have to think about the most if you're an arable farmer like myself. There's no point in growing something you can't separate it. Peas and barley being the key one I keep hearing. Can grow well together, but the split peas you can't get out of the barley. It can be an issue. This is why I like beans this year, beans and oilseed rape, because oilseed rape is going to be simple to clean out beans. Same with the peas and rape, that was fairly simple. The other picture up there was us with beans and oats last year, and I had a 15% yield increase, and it worked very well, but I didn't have the right screens, and the small beans I struggled to get out the oats. I think it can, because Doug, I think you did a similar mix, didn't you, and you managed to separate the beans and the oats okay?
No, I'm just doing that this year, but last year I had, going back to the peas and barley, I grew peas and barley together. It did reasonably well, but I did have problems with the split peas and the barley when I was separating it. But it was interesting because I didn't put any nitrogen on. I was worried about, I grow barley, spring barley for malting and for distilling, so I got to be below 1.6% nitrogen. I was worried that it might be above, but it was exactly the same as the rest of the farm, the monocrop spring barley, which had 100 kilos a hectare of nitrogen. So that was quite interesting. It was the same, but as Adrian said, it might be every year is different, and the mixture I could think around the mixture, but the barley did keep the peas up. Yields weren't fantastic, but it doesn't mean to say that I won't do it again.
Yeah, and I've experienced that every year is different. Last year the oilseed rape did well. This year's been pretty difficult. The next stage is to add another crop in. Now Roger's talked about peas and beans together. Well, why don't you put all three together? They'll separate. And it's just a risk management. With the weather we're having nowadays, I feel you have a bad spring, you have bad autumns, they keep coming. There's no normal year anymore. And the guys in Canada they can have no rain in the prairies. These guys were getting massive benefits from spreading their risk. The one big one being the chickpeas, that in a wet year they can use a fungicide 8 times on chickpeas to get to harvest. That's in 100 days, 120 days. They mixed it with linseed, or flax as they call it, 0 or 1. That's just a massive benefit. But we need to find out in this country what the best mixtures are and what works well. But for me, it's a risk management. Every year you're not going to get an LER of 1.3. I don't believe that. But I don't think I'll get an LER of 0.7. And whereas these spring crops like linseed, one year you get 2.5 tonne a hectare, next year you get 1 tonne a hectare. Well, for me, that's biggest game for me is in the break crops, just evening out that inconsistency.
How do you decide when to harvest?
The harvesting, and I did see a bit last year. I don't think they know why. I don't know. Adrian knows why, but when you put something together, their harvest dates do merge. Not necessarily perfectly. Last year we harvested when it stopped raining, and it probably was too late for the for the peas. Like most people in our area, we didn't get good colour peas. But I always say there's always what should be one dominant species in there. So for my beans and my rape, my main crop is my beans. Thankfully this year, because the rape's not going to come so much. So manage it for the beans, and the rape is a bonus. Same with the peas last year. The peas did well, and the beans did okay. I wouldn't have wanted to rely on the rape. So do pick one that you want to, one that you're going for.
Oh, you might turn that one off. One in, one out.
So you hello? Hello. Hello. So that's relay cropping, as I understand it. So you're trying to combine two of them.
Relay cropping is.
We got it wrong. Okay. So
Relay
my
cropping
question.
plant is this picture of John's there.
Yeah.
So John was in his winter oats. He planted buckwheat.
Yes.
full harvest.
Okay, so that's my question. Have you got a crop that you've sowed that works for the different crop that you don't harvest, but enhances the cash crop?
Well, this has been an example.
The vetch.
The winter was
Okay.
great.
And
And the white clover, if you can actually get it.
okay. Do you get problems with your vetch returning them seed bank wise and things
I've
like
never seen a vetch like that long to get. The vetch wouldn't go to seed.
that? It gets
But
killed off
buckwheat
every
was the-
week.
But I've never seen buckwheat in the conventional sense. Buckwheat's never been an issue.
Right.
That does go to seed in about 6 weeks.
Okay.
If-
Boston tolerance.
If you're growing, vetch and wheat, effectively, yeah. Vetch and clover, yeah, and the oilseed rape. What are you following that with?
Well,
With-
rape crop.
Yeah, when you've harvested it, you're putting it into wheat. What's your rotation?
That'd be followed by wheat.
Yeah. And the vetch is no problem.
Oh, sorry.
The vetch is no problem,
Vetch isn't there.
isn't it?
Sorry. It's
No, because we've grown vetch in a.
Sorry.
We're both turned up now.
It's
aren't
gone.
we? No, we've grown vetch in a cover crop, and getting rid of it was a problem.
Yeah.
what we planted it.
We didn't go up to 4 or 5 litres a hectare, but 3 litres a hectare made it look very ill, and then it recovered.
I've had that
Now we're on a heavy clay, quality soil. Probably makes a difference.
We got plenty of that, but I've never seen that. But AstroCurve will take vetch out of
Yeah.
oilseed rape.
Well, I've had a problem with vetch as using it. Sorry, I was using vetch as a cover crop, vetch and rye over winter cover crop, and I grazed it off for a month with sheep. And then I sprayed it with glyphosate, not enough, maybe 1.5 litres per hectare. Because I was ignorant then, I still am very ignorant. But, then the vetch, after being grazed off with sheep, it was taken right down to the deck, so the glyphosate didn't kill it. And then it came up in the following crop, which was the beans and oats companion crop. And I could take the vetch out in that, because it was with me picking up the beans, which was my main crop. So I had a 3-way mix, which I didn't intend, and I had to take the vetch and the oats, I couldn't separate with my rotary cleaner. So I had to get a gravity separator in. But every cloud's got a silver lining. I got the vetch separated with a gravity separator, and it was 85% germination. So now I've got 4 tons of vetch to be able to use as a particular cover crop.
Right, yeah.
I'd just ask David to say a few words about what you're up to this summer.
We've got a small area of rape, about half an acre. We put some yellow fruit or obviously put black fruit in, just as an experiment. We've also undersown a small area of spring wheat with both microclover and yellow trap oil. The only trouble with that, it's still there, but it was drilled too long after the crop was in. I mean, the wheat was about 4 inches. It's there. When I went to that oat bank presentation, of course, I can't use his name now, said about companion cropping like that. You've got solar
panels on your barn, you wouldn't turn them off in August, September. And okay, so that's what you're doing when you've got bare ground. So the idea being, I think we'll try on a bigger scale next year. They even had some rake understone but once the crop's off, they were saying, the whole drop wants away. So as opposed to even planting a catch crop after the crop, it's there and just takes off. So that's the thing that we're interested in. We're not geared up like Andy to be able to clean one crop out of another, unfortunately. I think it's all interesting stuff, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. So is that the microclover is that the same as the small leaf clover?
Well, this is just a small leaf chamomile.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just a brand.
Okay, yeah.
It's in Alderberg brand. But it's cheap, so if it doesn't work, then quite a big hit.
Yeah. Established for right.
Sorry?
How was your establishment?
Well, it's not. Is it? The microclover we've gone over earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's standards out lots and wants to pop off.
Would we visit that you would actually put it in the
You would want to, yeah, you would want to put it on a large scale like a week with it set for time.
No, because it's just a standard 30 years.
We've got more
Lady,
questions.
question.
Yeah.
I'm from Southwest, I'm at Flag. In Somerset we've got a huge area of maize sown. Obviously late harvested, we've got real quality flooding issues, erosion of their maize stubble. Cover crops put in after maize, often too late to do anything. Has anybody got any experience of maybe establishing a cover crop and sowing the maize into it? Anybody in this room got any experience of that at all?
I know you have. Kate Spigade, who's around. He works for YS Trust. They've now got just bought a second drill and they're busy undersowing maize at the moment.
No, I'm not so much undersowing, I'm thinking of actually sowing maize into an established, something like clover or...
Okay.
Somebody up here, I've seen it already, somebody up here is showing a demonstration.
That's strip tillage, that's into permanent pasture, which...
I think you could probably do, we've done it into clover,
Have
like
you?
wheat, not maize, but wheat we've cut into clover. So I think I think there was a DESA funded project looking at, it's not strip tillage, but it's the strip tillage technique is very much, you know...
Because I'm feeling if you've got a good green cover, which will come after the maize...
Be there before harvest. I think that's where that comes into play. The wheat, well, soy doesn't grow very well when it's by itself, so I struggle to see the soya unless they breeding changes. But I'm not saying it won't work, but I'm not sure our growing seasons are quite long enough. I wouldn't want to be harvesting buckwheat in November, to be honest. So for me, the potential is to establish cover crops or establish an undersown lay, a clover in your standing crop, not to have 2 harvests per year. The only one I did see in France, or no, Switzerland, sorry, was when they planted red clover, buckwheat and oilseed rape together and harvested them at 3 separate times. So over 15 months, they had 3 harvests from one plant. So maybe that's potential to have a cereal and a clover and get a clover seed crop after an early cereal. I'm sure surely it could work, but a lot more difficult for us.
You've done any work with that at James Hudson? Any questions? Yes, I'm interested, so you set out to reduce your inputs by 50% in, I don't know where the other one's from. Yeah.
Another one's behind me.
Oh, is it? Oh yeah, so we don't get confused. Yeah, I know you set out to reduce your input by 50% in 5 years.
Yeah.
How has the planning cropping intercropping contributed to that? Have you been able to reduce your inputs basically? And pest suppression benefits?
Fertiliser on winter wheat we've reduced by 30%, but that's not necessarily much to do with intercropping. That's the whole system, biology. Fungicides, for example, in that crop there, I didn't need any fungicides. there was no disease in the oilseed rape or the peas. So I'm on track to reduce my fertiliser by 50% in the next 2 years. Milling protein's what I've got to be careful with, but I was just about fine last year. And fungicides, I don't think we'll be using, past the next 2 years, I don't think I'll be using hardly any. Insecticides is a different one. If you're growing in spring or seed rape and trying to reduce insecticides, it's not necessarily very easy.
Yeah, I guess that would be my question is about flea beetle. I know we're trying to look at how we can measure that difference, but
With oilseed rape,
yeah, in the oilseed rape, that what
for winter oilseed rape, people have anecdotally found that it works. And I know in France they use one less insecticide on oilseed rape for flea beetle companion crops. But I did notice this year, and while Simon sat there, I was walking through my linseed this year, and flax flea beetle being terrible in linseed this year. Where I had wild oats, a patch of wild oats, the flea beetle weren't touching the linseed. So my plan for next year is to put a low rate of oats in my linseed, and use that to hopefully reduce my need for flea beetle control, and then just take it out with grassweed herbicide.
just because there's other.
I think they were just, I don't know, they're confused, or the linseed enjoyed growing with the oats. I don't know what it was, but it was a definite. It works, so that's my plan. Next year it might not work, but 20-30 kilograms of oats. Oats are cheap to sell, so they're not going to cost very much.
Yeah. Does anyone else in here had a go at anything? Any crop mixtures?
We'll just make one more.
Yeah.
Variety mix.
I wasn't going to comment about variety mixes, but they're great. No, it's something based on the principle of variety mixes, or mixes in general. The way they work is through a barrier effect of the resistant type to any component population pathogen. Dilution of susceptible and induced resistance. Now put that in a species mixture, and that seemed to exaggerate that effect. So in several years of doing mixtures of different species, I've only ever once had a disease problem, and that's when I used triticale, which was extremely yellow rust susceptible. Apart from that, I really have had very little disease to score, which is very disappointing as a pathologist. But it really does seem to lower your disease thresholds or your levels in general very dramatically. So it makes them really, looking at it, really, it's a component of integrated pest management, isn't it, for diversification. So it's working in that sense.
I guess, is there any more questions? Yeah?
The only thing I was to bring up that we were talking the other week, wasn't it, about swapping different varieties of wheat. This was very popular 30 years ago, and it sort of faded out, and someone said it was a seed cut. I don't know, I was not very involved with that, but is that even another thought for reducing fungicide usage?
Well, Adrian's the expert in the country, he's going to start next year.
I've been spending years having people telling me to not do it because it's a waste of time and the trade doesn't want it. But it actually works. So yeah, that's exactly it. So for example, winter barley, where you haven't got the quality issue in the market, i.e. you haven't got the maltsters saying I only want this variety and nothing else, then yes, it does work. And you've got enough diversity amongst the varieties available to reduce disease quite a bit and increase yield. It's basically a better use of resources, increase resource utilisation. So it works there well. In winter wheat, you get small benefits. The trouble with most winter wheats is agronomically they're so incredibly similar, you get very few synergies between them. But it still gives some stability, and in fact we did some work where the farmers who grew the winter wheat mixture got a premium for 2 or 3 years, so that was quite well, worked well. In spring barley, for the malting market in Scotland, you can't sell it, so nobody will do it. Even though actually we did it on a basis of a couple of fields full of a mixture once, which we got a maltster to malt, it gave no problem whatsoever. We got the distiller to take it as a load, and he said it gave the highest alcohol yield of any batch he had taken in that year. And when asked if I could quote the data from Ireland, he said, "Don't you dare we mention we're involved in this project at all." So that's what sometimes hammers things where there's particular quality criteria like this. But yeah, it's diversity again. It's diversity working at all these different levels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think just from the discussions we've had within Diversify, so Diversify is a European project that James Hudson involved in as well. We've had various discussions with farmer groups, people that are trying intercropping and not. And one of the barriers is the markets, one of the big barriers is the market. So yeah, it'd just be interesting to hear as well from those of you that are doing it and those of you that aren't, how could the markets better support you to be able to do this? I know in France, for example, you can sell mixtures and the buyers will separate them. Are there any other ways that we could look at, like going forward, visioning how we can have markets that better support intercropping and diverse cropping systems? Andy? And Roger. Andy and Roger.
The only one I've heard of is intercropping barley and peas in Germany, and they were selling the beer as intercrop beer, but most people don't know the difference between organic and conventional. Trying to market it as intercropping, I think, I'm not sure, I don't know what your views are. I think you've got to just hope you get better quality and then sell it on the quality. It does come back to the fact, well, what variety is it on the passport? And for our Group 1s, my merchant reckons that I can sell him a blend and he's quite happy. Group 3s, Group 4s is fine. But yeah, you have to be careful with peas, I guess.
Yeah, the best quality peas require a really uniform, bright and bold colour, and anything that compromises that is always going to be viewed as substandard. If they're headed just for the feed industry, then I guess things might be a little bit different. And also, perhaps if we see an expansion in the use of legume crops for protein extraction, then perhaps peas and beans could, in theory, end up in the same process, with protein extracted and resultant co-products like starch being used for, who knows, brewing or baking in another way. But I think that's a long way away, and I tend to agree with Andy at the moment that really just got to concentrate on getting good quality.
I just think that if you're growing barley with peas, to ensure you get a good standing of peas, just take the barley out. Use it. The pigeons will fly over and think it's still the barley. And then the weevil, they don't attack the peas or beans either. So you get a head start basically. So just use it. So that's where I like companion cropping. In the rate, put your birds in, clover in, put your beans in, just mix it up and then take it out when you don't want it. Seems a no-brainer to me.
So I guess the two things that we're looking at within the field lab as well is ultimately the yield differences and the gross margin, and that's really where the test is, isn't it? So, any more questions? Yep.
Just responding to that last comment, when we grew the peas and oats together, one of the questions was, will you get them to harvest at the same time? And in truth, we had to burn the oats off because they were going to be far too late, and our primary interest was in the peas. Nonetheless, there were live grains there. And you start thinking creatively about what you might do with them. Well, actually one way was we didn't really want to harvest the barley anyway, so we just blew it out the back of the combine and kept the peas. And what did we have? A ready-made cover crop, so there are different ways, and I think everyone will find their own way through.
I will say there's no right answer. No one's an expert, and do what suits your system, and don't try and overcomplicate it. And if you haven't got a separatable, then don't try it. But just keep it simple.
Do you, when you intercrop, then do you do it on alternate rows, or do you mix it in with the next
For most of the studies I've seen, it's because it's an above ground and below ground benefit. You might as well just mix it together. Depending on your drill, if your drill you can't do that, you have to go on alternate rows, fine. But if you think about its diversity, it's back to the old monoculture, having a monoculture, alternating it underground. But the only one that does work that I've seen evidence for was the chickpea and flax, where the flax was an actual physical disease barrier between the rows of chickpeas. They had about 22 inches between the rows of chickpeas, and that was stopping the disease. There was an actual physical barrier. So in most cases I'd say just mix them if you can, and don't get too hung up on seeding depth either.
I was always been told that you've got to homogeneously mix it. So with this, when working with say barley mixers, so you'd have to put the seed through a grass seed mixer or something like this. So I actually tried this in the field with about 4 different types of mixing, anything from homogeneously mixed to putting a layer of one variety and another variety, which sort of basically came out with a sort of smudged interface. But one of the way that worked best was we actually put the varieties in one after another and then jumped into the hopper with a shovel and churned it up. So we got a very crude mixture which came out quite patchy. That out-yielded all the other. So patchy, again, it's heterogeneity. It's about diversity in the field, in the actual spatial way things are growing. It seems as though the patchy way that came out actually worked better. So anyone who was paying to get the seed homogeneously mixing was just throwing their money away in that particular case. So yeah, a very crude mixture. And in talking to one of the farmers in Fife who was doing winter barley mixtures, when I told him this, he said, "Oh, well, that's probably what I do because I stick an auger into the trailer and put it in the seed drill that way, so it probably comes out very patchy." And I'm very worried about it. You're probably doing the best thing. Patchiness actually works at some level. Presumably it works for different species as well. I haven't actually tried it.
There's a guy I saw in Canada who was variable rate seeding his intercrops, so he knew that certain high places and low places grew the rape and peas. He was actually putting a higher proportion of rape in one part of the field, and a lower proportion, he was actually changing the rates going across the field because he was finding that the rape would do well in there, peas would do well in there. So that's the next stage on, which I haven't got to, but it just highlights that thinking with this uniformity, different rows, yeah, it's almost hanging on to the old monoculture way of farming.
Oh, there we go. You want to tell us a bit about what you're up to as well? I have pictures.
We started some years ago growing beans with wheat and had variable amounts of success with it. Our favourite cover crop was cereal rye and common veg. Then I got to thinking, well, if common veg is Vicia sativa, and why shouldn't it work well with Vicia flava, which is beans? So we grow rye with our winter beans. And we find that there's a much better, I think I get a much better response from the beans by growing it with rye than I do with wheat. There's something going on with the soil, which is great.
You got any thoughts on that?
What we do is we go through first and drill the beans and put them in about 4 inches deep, keep them away from the roots, and then we over drill it with the rye under the normal cereal drill. And you can do that up to a week later.
Conventional organic or?
Organic.
And you've seen good results then?
Yeah, I think the beans grow much better.
Yeah.
Sort of, yeah. You don't get a huge rye crop, but the rye has also got the vigour to keep up with the height of the beans.
Yeah.
Whereas the wheat often just gets lost.
Yeah, yeah. Have you seen that in your mixtures as well? Yeah.
Sometimes. The stuff I saw in Sweden, they're finding the older varieties of peas and things are actually better at intercropping compared to modern varieties. So my comment would be modern wheats are pretty pathetic, aren't very competing. Your rye is older variety, you know, it's an older genetic, so it's probably why you see a benefit. And they found that in peas and barley, the older varieties of peas they were finding were better in intercrop, but as a sole crop they're a disaster.
What about the rotation as well? I don't think we've talked about that yet, have we? And it's always a question that comes up. How's this going to fit into our rotation?
Yeah, rotation's always a challenge, obviously. I mean, there's still an awful lot of unknowns, particularly around pulses, brassicas, how they fit with the rotations. There, obviously, disease sort of implications, pests. Maybe, you know, we do see reductions in certain crops, but there's still sort of potential build up with if you've like got green bridges. I don't think we understand those enough to really, but it's certainly something to be quite cautious of. I mean, the work we've done, we've always seen on the rotational element of things. You know, we have got to look at the rotation as a full. It's not very helpful just to look at a single sort of crop, and particularly that some of these responses are not in a single crop. They are over time, over a number of rotations. So it's more important to look at that respect. But yes, I think it's quite complicated. I don't think we do fully understand.
It's the question that I asked everyone I went to see and no one had an answer. The only things I got was, well, one guy had been doing it for 15 years, growing a pulse every other year and didn't have a problem. And the other answer would be, well, if your diversity is high enough throughout the system, it shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
But keeping diversity all the way through the system isn't very easy. So we don't know, but
Yep.
if you are going to do it, I'd keep the diversity high
Yep.
in the cover crops and everything else.
Minimise that, yeah.
Well, the only reason I'm shaking my head is I have no idea, and we barely understand the root related problems in pulses anyway. There's a lot of research going on for that now, including the role that cover crops and catch crops might have in mitigating some of the problems, but we don't have the answer.
Yeah. Okay. So, any more last questions, or I might just ask, so if, you know, next year, what's the kind of dream planting? What combinations are you thinking about for the future? Yeah, it's a top secret. I've got enough going on. Yeah.
If there was a dream combination, you shouldn't grow it because we'll lose the diversity.
That's true. That's a very good point.
Everybody else.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming along and joining us. Special thanks to Roger and Andy and Nathan, and also to yourself, Adrian, everyone else that contributed. Do get involved in ecology. We're free. It's all about sharing knowledge on sustainable farming and using more ecology to enhance our farming system. So follow us on Twitter, have a look on the website, come along to events. So yeah, and do feel free to stay in here, help yourself to drinks and snacks, and yeah, we'll be having more talks in here later on as well. Thank you. Oh, and there's lots of resources on intercropping on agroecology, so if you want to learn more, that's the place to go.